They called him the coldest noble in England, a man carved from winter itself, untouchable, unreachable, ruling his frozen empire from a throne no one dared approach. But what happens when a woman with nothing to lose accidentally stumbles into the one place he cannot defend? His own loneliness? This is a story that will shatter everything you think you know about power, pride, and the terrifying cost of letting someone in. Stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to know where my people are watching from tonight. Does. Blackthorn Hall did not sit on the winter hills of Derbyshire. It consumed them. Stone walls thick enough to swallow cannon fire rose from frozen earth like the bones of something ancient and mean, and the wind that screamed across the moors bent itself around those walls as though even weather understood who ruled here. The estate stretched for miles in every direction, swallowing villages, tenant farms, forest land, all of it locked beneath a gray December sky that had not seen sun in 11 days. Locals in the valley below called the place different names depending on how much ale they had consumed. The fortress, the tomb, the place where laughter went to die. None of them were wrong. Inside the east wing, a fire cracked and spit against blackened stone. The study smelled of old leather, cold ink, and something sharper underneath, the metallic tang of a man who had not slept in 2 days. Duke Lucian Ravenscar stood at the window with his back to the room, watching snow erase the last visible stretch of road connecting his estate to the outside world. He was 34 years old, tall enough to fill a doorway without trying, built lean and hard, the way men get when they eat from discipline rather than appetite. His dark hair was pushed back from a face that might have been handsome if anything behind it had ever bothered to be warm. His jaw was set in that permanent clench that his household staff had learned to read the way sailors read storm clouds. He had not spoken to another human being in 9 hours. This was not unusual. Behind him, his steward, Mr. Aldrich Voss, stood 3 paces from the desk holding a leather folio against his chest like a shield. Voss was 56, wiry, silver-haired, and possessed the particular talent of making himself physically smaller whenever the Duke's mood turned dangerous. He had served 3 generations of Ravenscars. He knew exactly how much silence a man could survive before it started eating him alive. The accounts from the northern tenants require your signature, Your Grace. Lucien did not turn from the window. Leave them. And Lady Ashcombe's correspondence has arrived. 3rd letter this week. Burn it. Voss hesitated. Not long. Just enough for the pause to carry weight. Her father, Lord Ashcombe, has also written. He references the spring arrangements, the understanding between the families. Lucian's reflection in the glass was barely visible. Just the outline of a jaw, the flat line of a mouth that never curved upward. There is no understanding, Voss. There is an expectation. Other people's expectations are not my concern. With respect, Your Grace, Lord Ashcombe commands significant influence in Parliament. The alliance would... Would what? Lucien turned then, and the firelight hit his face in a way that made the shadows under his eyes look like bruises. Secure my position? My position was secured before I inherited it. My grandfather built this estate on land grants no one can challenge. My father doubled the holdings. I have tripled the income. I do not need Adrian Ashcombe's influence, and I do not need his daughter. Voss lowered his gaze. Of course, Your Grace. Is there anything else? The new kitchen staff arrived this morning, 3 girls from the village agency. Mrs. Hargrove has assigned them to the lower household. Fine. One of them is quite young, 17 or 18. Mrs. Hargrove expressed some concern about her stamina. Apparently the girl walked 7 miles through the snow to reach the gate. Lucien's expression did not change. If she made it through 7 miles of snow, her stamina is not the problem. Put her to work. Voss nodded, tucked the folio tighter, and retreated. The door closed behind him with the careful precision of a man who understood that in this house, even the sound of a latch carried consequences. Lucien turned back to the window. The snow was thicker now, falling in curtains so dense the tree line had vanished entirely. Somewhere out there, buried under all that white silence, the world kept turning. People laughed. People touched each other without calculating the cost. People said things they actually meant. He pressed his knuckles against the frozen glass until the cold bit through his skin and settled into the bone. He could not remember the last time he had said something he meant. 3 floors below, in the servants' corridor that ran like a vein beneath the main house, Isolde Vale was trying not to collapse. She had been awake for 19 hours. Her feet were swollen inside boots that had soaked through 6 miles ago, and the skin on her hands was cracked from cold in places that would not stop bleeding. She was 18 years old, 5'4", too thin by half, with dark hair pulled back so tight it made her temples ache, and gray eyes that held the kind of exhaustion money could not touch because it came from somewhere deeper than the body. Mrs. Hargrove, the head housekeeper, walked ahead of her through the corridor at a pace designed to punish. The woman was built like a wardrobe, broad, square, immovable, and she spoke without turning around, her voice bouncing off stone walls that sweated with condensation. "You will rise at 4. Fires lit by 4:30. Breakfast preparation begins at 5. You are responsible for the east wing hearths, the upper gallery, and whatever additional tasks I assign before midday. You eat after the household has been served. You do not speak to guests. You do not enter the family quarters without explicit instruction. You do not exist above the second floor. Is that clear?" Isolde's voice came out raw. "Yes, ma'am. Your room is at the end of this hall. You share it with Nell and Agnes. Keep your belongings in your trunk. Nothing on the shelves. Nothing on the floor." "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Hargrove stopped at a narrow door and turned for the first time. Her eyes moved over Isolde the way a butcher examines a cut of meat, clinical, disinterested, already calculating how much use could be extracted before the thing wore out. "You're here because the agency sent you, and because we are short-staffed. That is the only reason. Do not mistake proximity for belonging. This is Blackthorn Hall. You serve it. It does not owe you anything." Isolde met the woman's eyes. Something flickered there. Not defiance exactly, but the stubborn residue of a person who had been told she was nothing. So many times the words had lost their teeth. "I understand." Mrs. Hargrove studied her for one more second, then turned and walked away without another word. Isolde pushed open the door. The room was barely larger than a closet. 2 narrow beds pushed against opposite walls, a single candle on a shelf, and a draft coming through the window frame that made the flame shiver. Nell and Agnes were already asleep, their breathing thin and rhythmic in the darkness. Isolde sat on the edge of the empty bed. She unlaced her ruined boots with fingers that shook, peeled off stockings stiff with ice water, and pressed her bare feet against the stone floor. The cold shot up through her ankles and into her calves like voltage. She did not flinch. She had learned a long time ago that flinching was a luxury reserved for people who had someone to notice. She lay back on the mattress without pulling the blanket over herself. The ceiling was low enough to touch. Somewhere above her, through layers of stone and timber and wealth she would never comprehend, the Duke of Blackthorn slept in rooms she would never see, surrounded by silence she would never understand. Or maybe he did not sleep at all. She closed her eyes, and the darkness swallowed her whole. The first 3 days were a blur of labor and invisibility. Isolde carried ash buckets until her shoulders burned. She scrubbed grates on her knees until the skin split. She learned the geography of the house the way an animal learns a cage, by touching every wall, memorizing every corridor, cataloging every space where she was permitted to exist and every threshold she was forbidden to cross. The other servants watched her the way prey animals watch a newcomer enter the herd, cautious, calculating, waiting to see whether she would make their lives harder or easier. Nell, a red-haired girl with anxious hands, offered her bread on the second morning without saying anything. Agnes, older, harder, with a mouth that had forgotten how to smile, simply ignored her. It was on the third evening that Isolde first encountered Lady Seraphine Ashcombe. She was carrying a tray of tea service through the upper gallery when a door opened ahead of her and a woman stepped into the hallway as though the house had manufactured her from its most expensive materials. Lady Seraphine was 26, golden-haired, porcelain-skinned, dressed in midnight blue silk that moved like water when she walked. She was beautiful in the way that weapons are beautiful, precise, deliberate, designed to inflict damage from a distance you never see coming. Seraphine stopped, looked at Isolde, looked at the tray. "You are new." "Yes, my lady." "What is your name?" "Isolde, my lady. Isolde Val." Seraphine's eyes narrowed by a fraction so small most people would have missed it entirely. But Isolde had spent her whole life reading the faces of people who held power over her, and she caught it. That tiny contraction around the pupils that meant someone was filing information away for future use. "Val, I do not know that name." "Where are you from?" "Hartfield, my lady, the village south of—" "I know where Hartfield is." Seraphine's voice was silk over glass. "It is a nothing place, a mud track with pretensions." She paused, smiled. The smile did not reach anywhere near her eyes. Carry on, Isolde, and do try not to spill. Mrs. Hargrove tells me the china in this house is worth more than your entire family. She turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the floor in a rhythm that sounded like a clock counting down to something. Isolde stood in the hallway with the tray in her hands and her heart hammering against her ribs, not from fear, from recognition. She had known women like Seraphine Ashcombe her entire life. Women who smiled while they measured you for a coffin. Women who spoke softly because they never needed to shout. The damage was always done before you heard it coming. She carried the tray to the drawing room, set it on the sideboard without spilling a single drop, and walked back to the servants' corridor with her spine straight and her jaw locked. She would not give that woman a single inch. The incident happened on the fourth night, and it happened because of exhaustion so complete it erased every rational thought from Isolde's mind. Mrs. Hargrove had assigned her to prepare the East Wing guest chambers for a visiting party expected the following afternoon. This meant fires in 6 rooms, fresh linens on 8 beds, polished brass on every fixture, and floors swept to a standard that would satisfy a woman whose standards existed primarily to ensure that someone was always failing to meet them. Isolde had started at 7 in the evening. By midnight, she had finished 5 rooms, and her vision was beginning to blur at the edges, the world softening into shapes that no longer held their boundaries. She pushed open the door to the last room on the corridor, stepped inside, and immediately understood that something was different. The fire was already burning. The bed was made with sheets she had not touched. Dark linen, heavy, expensive, smelling faintly of cedar and something colder underneath, like iron or winter air. The room was twice the size of the guest chambers. 3 tall windows faced the moor. A desk sat against the far wall, covered in papers, weighted down with a stone paperweight shaped like a raven. Some part of her brain tried to send a warning. This is wrong. This is not where you are supposed to be. Get out. But her body had stopped listening to her brain hours ago. The fire was warm, the room was quiet, and the exhaustion that had been building inside her for days, not just the physical labor, but the deeper tiredness, the bone-level weariness of being invisible and unwanted and constantly afraid, rose up like a wave and pulled her under. She sat on the edge of the bed, just for a moment, just to close her eyes. She was asleep in 30 seconds. Her body curled instinctively toward warmth, and within minutes she was lying across the Duke's bed with her ash-stained hands pressed against his pillow. She did not hear the door open an hour later. Lucien Ravenscar stood in the doorway of his own bedroom and stared at the impossible thing lying in his bed. A girl, a servant girl, curled on her side with her face pressed into his pillow, her dark hair spilling across the linen, her cracked hands tucked against her chest like a child protecting something fragile. She was still wearing her work dress. Her boots were on. There was ash on her wrists and a smear of soot across her left cheekbone. He should have called for Voss. He should have woken her immediately, summoned Mrs. Hargrove, and had the girl dismissed before sunrise. The scandal alone, a servant found in the Duke's bedchamber, would be enough to ruin her permanently and create precisely the kind of gossip that enemies like the Ashcombes could weaponize for months. He did none of those things. Instead, he stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and walked to the fireplace. He stood there with one hand on the mantel and looked at her the way a man looks at something he does not have a category for. She was thin, exhausted in a way that sleep alone could not repair. Her breathing was shallow and uneven, catching in her throat every few seconds, as though even unconscious, she could not fully let go of whatever tension had been holding her together. He noticed the cracks in her hands, the swelling in her knuckles, the way her boots were dark with moisture that had frozen and thawed and frozen again. Something moved inside his chest. Not warmth exactly, more like a wall shifting. One of those deep structural walls that hold up the entire architecture of a man's interior life. The ones you build so early and reinforce so thoroughly that you forget they are walls at all and start believing they are just the shape of who you are. He stood by the fire for 47 minutes. He did not sit down. He did not look away. When the logs shifted and sent a spark popping against the grate, Isolde's eyes opened. For 3 seconds, she did not move. Her brain processed information in layers. Warmth, firelight, unfamiliar sheets, the smell of cedar and iron. Then a figure standing by the fireplace, tall, dark-haired, watching her with an expression she could not read. The recognition hit her like cold water. She sat up so fast she nearly fell off the bed. I. Oh no. No, no, no. She was on her feet, swaying, her hands shaking, her face draining of color so quickly it looked like someone had pulled a plug. Your Grace, I am so sorry. I did not. I was cleaning the rooms and I thought. I did not know this was. Stop! His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It filled the room the way cold fills an empty house. Completely, without effort, leaving no space for anything else. Isolde stopped. Her chest was heaving. Her hands were clenched at her sides. She looked like a rabbit that had wandered into a wolf's den and was calculating exactly how many seconds she had left to live. Lucian studied her. What is your name? Isolde, Your Grace, Isolde Vale. I was assigned to prepare the guest chambers, and I must have taken the wrong door, and You fell asleep. Yes, Your Grace. In my bed. Yes, Your Grace. Her voice cracked. I will leave immediately. I understand if you need to dismiss me. Please, if there is any way this does not have to follow me to the next position, I would. Who assigned you to prepare 6 guest rooms alone? The question caught her off guard. She blinked. Mrs. Hargrove, Your Grace. At what hour? 7 o'clock, Your Grace. And before that, what were your duties today? The East Wing hearths, the upper gallery floors, the silver cleaning, the breakfast service, and the afternoon coal delivery for the. That is a 16-hour workload. Isolde said nothing. The statement did not seem to require a response, and she had already learned that in this house, the wrong word at the wrong moment was more dangerous than silence. Lucien's jaw tightened. Not at her. At something behind her. Something structural. He turned back to the fire and spoke without looking at her. Go to your room. Sleep. Tell no one about this. I will speak to Mrs. Hargrove about the workload distribution in the morning. Your Grace, That was not a request, Miss Vale. She stood there for one more heartbeat. Then she moved toward the door on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. Her hand was on the latch when his voice stopped her. Miss Vale? She turned. He was still facing the fire. The light caught the side of his face, and for the first time she saw something there that she had not expected. Not anger. Not contempt. Something closer to exhaustion, the kind that had nothing to do with physical labor and everything to do with the weight of being a man who had spent his entire life standing alone in rooms exactly like this one. You walked 7 miles through the snow to reach this house. It was not a question, but she answered anyway. Yes, Your Grace. Why? She held his gaze across the firelit room. Because I had nowhere else to go. Something passed across his face. Fast. Buried almost before it surfaced. Then it was gone, and the mask was back. Cold, composed, impenetrable. Good night, Miss Vale. She slipped through the door and closed it behind her without making a sound. Lucian stood at the fireplace and listened to her footsteps disappear down the corridor. When the silence returned, it felt different than before. Heavier. Like the room had absorbed something it could not digest. He looked at the bed, at the impression her body had left in the sheets, at the faint smear of ash on the pillow where her cheek had rested. He did not call for fresh linens. He sat in the chair beside the fire and stayed there until dawn turned the windows gray, and for the first time in years, the silence in Blackthorn Hall felt less like armor and more like a wound. The next morning, Isolde woke to the sound of Agnes banging a water pitcher against the washstand and the gray light of a Derbyshire dawn that looked like the sky had given up on color entirely. Move, Agnes said. Hargrove wants the fires lit 10 minutes early. Lord Ashcomb's party is arriving before noon. Isolde's body protested every movement. Her shoulders ached, her hands throbbed. The memory of the previous night sat in her chest like a stone she could not swallow. The Duke's room, his bed, his voice cutting through her panic with that terrifying calm. She dressed in 4 minutes, laced her boots with fingers that felt like they belonged to a dead woman, and made her way to the East Wing. The corridor was still dark. She was the first one moving, the way she was always the first one moving, because showing up early was the only currency a person with nothing could spend. She knelt at the first hearth, raked the ash, laid the kindling, and struck the flint until the spark caught. The fire bloomed, warmth pushed against her face. For 1 second, just one, she let herself feel it. Then she heard footsteps behind her and stood up so fast her knees cracked. It was Lady Seraphine, dressed for breakfast already, her golden hair pinned in a style that probably took a maid 45 minutes to achieve, her face arranged in that precise expression of pleasant interest that powerful women wore the way soldiers wore armor. Isolde, good morning. Good morning, my lady. Seraphine tilted her head. You look unwell. Did you not sleep? I slept fine, my lady. Seraphine moved closer. Her perfume reached Isolde first. Something floral and heavy, the kind of scent designed to announce presence before the person wearing it said a word. Mrs. Hargrove mentioned you were working quite late last night, preparing the guest rooms. Yes, my lady. All 6 of them. Alone. Yes, my lady. Seraphine's smile widened. How industrious. I do admire dedication in the staff. It is so rare these days. She paused. Let the pause stretch. Tell me, did you finish all 6 rooms? Isolde's heart slammed against her ribs. She kept her face neutral through sheer force of will. I did, my lady. Every single one. Yes, my lady. Seraphine studied her for a long moment. Then she laughed, a light musical sound that carried absolutely no warmth. Wonderful. I shall let Mrs. Hargrove know she can count on you for future assignments of that scope. She turned and walked away, her silk skirts whispering against the floor. Isolde stood beside the fire and breathed. Her hands were shaking again, not from cold this time, from the unmistakable certainty that Lady Seraphine Ashcombe was testing her, probing for cracks, looking for whatever piece of information could be turned into a weapon. She did not know what Seraphine suspected, but the woman suspected something. That much was carved into every syllable of that conversation like a blade hidden inside a velvet glove. By noon, Blackthorn Hall had transformed into a performance. Lord Adrian Ashcombe arrived with a retinue of 4, 2 aides, a valet, and an elderly gentleman introduced as Sir Percival Whitmore, whose function appeared to be nodding approvingly at everything Lord Ashcombe said. Adrian himself was 51, silver-templed, broad-shouldered, carrying the particular brand of authority that comes from a man who has spent 3 decades in rooms where decisions get made and has never once been the person those decisions happen to. The household assembled in the entrance hall. Lucien stood at the foot of the main staircase in a dark coat that fit him like a threat, his expression arranged in that careful nothing that his staff had learned to fear more than outright anger. Seraphine stood beside him, close enough to imply possession, not so close as to appear desperate. Adrian Ashcombe crossed the threshold, stamped snow from his boots, and surveyed the hall with the satisfaction of a man inspecting property he considered already his. Lucien, you look well. Adrian. The 2 men shook hands. The grip lasted exactly 2 seconds, long enough for courtesy, short enough to communicate that neither of them trusted the other with a sharp object. The roads were abysmal, Adrian said. We lost a wheel outside Renford and nearly froze waiting for the repair. I trust your hospitality will compensate. Blackthorn Hall provides for its guests. I have no doubt. Adrian's gaze shifted to Seraphine. Something moved in his expression. Satisfaction, calculation, the quiet pleasure of a chess player watching his pieces land in position. Seraphine, my dear, you look radiant. Thank you, Father. Lucian's jaw tightened by a fraction so small, only someone watching very carefully would have caught it. And Isolde, standing at the far end of the hall with a tray of wine glasses she had been ordered to hold until summoned, was watching very carefully indeed. She saw the way Lucien's shoulders locked when Adrian touched Seraphine's arm. She saw the way his eyes went flat, not angry, not resigned, but vacant, as though he had pulled some essential part of himself behind a door and locked it from the inside. She had seen that look before, on the faces of people who had stopped fighting, not because they had lost, but because they had decided winning was not worth the cost of continuing to feel. Dinner that evening was a theater production disguised as a meal. 12 people seated around a table that could hold 30, candlelight making everyone's faces look softer and more dangerous than they actually were. Lucien sat at the head, Adrian to his right, Seraphine across from her father, positioned perfectly in Lucien's line of sight. Isolde served wine. She moved along the table in the silent choreography that servants learned the way dancers learned routines, invisible, precise, anticipating every need before it became a demand. She kept her eyes down. She kept her hands steady. She poured Lord Ashcombe's glass without a tremor. But when she reached Lucien's chair, his hand moved slightly on the table. Not a gesture, not a signal, just a shift of his fingers against the cloth. And she looked up. Their eyes met for less than a second. In that fraction of time, something passed between them that neither of them could have named. Not recognition exactly, not attraction, something more fundamental. The wordless acknowledgement between two people who understood what it felt like to be alone in a room full of people performing happiness. She poured his wine. He did not thank her. She moved on. But Adrian Ashcombe, who had built his entire career on noticing things other people missed, watched the exchange from across the table. His fork paused halfway to his mouth. His eyes moved from Lucien to the retreating servant girl, then back to Lucien. He filed the observation away with the efficiency of a man who collected leverage the way other men collected art. Midway through the second course, Adrian leaned forward and aimed his voice at Lucien with the precision of a man loading a rifle. I understand the northern tenants have been restless, something about renegotiated lease terms. The terms were predatory, Lucien said. I adjusted them. Adjusted? Adrian smiled. You mean you reduced the rents, during a season when every estate in England is raising them? I mean, I ensured the people working my land could survive the winter without choosing between food and fuel. Seraphine laughed, soft and well-timed. How charitable, Your Grace. Lucien did not look at her. It is not charity, Lady Ashcombe. It is arithmetic. Dead tenants produce nothing. Starving tenants produce less. A man who cannot see that is not fit to manage a garden, let alone an estate. The table went quiet. Adrian's smile did not waver, but something behind it shifted, the same way ice shifts on a river, just before it breaks. You have always had a talent for provocation, Lucien. Your father was the same way, though he eventually learned that governance requires alliances, not just convictions. My father died at 52, Lucien said, surrounded by allies, alone. The silence that followed lasted 6 full seconds. Isolde counted them from her position near the sideboard. 6 seconds of every person at that table holding their breath while two men stared at each other across crystal and silver and the ruins of a courtesy that had never been real. Adrian picked up his wine glass. Well, he said, I see the Ravenscar directness has not diminished with the generation. It has not. Good. Adrian drank, set the glass down, smiled. I look forward to discussing the spring arrangements in more detail, perhaps tomorrow, when we have both had the benefit of rest. The meal continued. Courses arrived and departed. Conversations resumed with the careful rhythm of people pretending the temperature in the room had not just dropped 20 degrees. Isolde cleared plates, refilled glasses, moved through the room like a ghost who had accidentally learned to carry china. At 10:30, the guests retired. Seraphine lingered in the hallway outside the dining room, adjusting her gloves with the studied casualness of a woman waiting to be noticed. Lucien walked past her without stopping. Your Grace, Seraphine said. Might I have a moment? He paused, did not turn. It is late, Lady Ashcombe. It will only be a moment. She moved closer. Her voice dropped to something designed to sound intimate and instead sounded strategic. I wanted you to know that I understand the pressures you face. My father can be insistent, but I am not my father. I am not here to pressure you. I am here because I believe we could build something together, something real. Lucien turned then, looked at her. His face was absolutely empty. Lady Ashcombe, I appreciate your candor, but I do not build things with people who audition for the position. He walked away. His footsteps echoed down the corridor and disappeared. Seraphine stood alone in the hallway. Her hands were perfectly still at her sides. Her face was perfectly composed, but her eyes told a different story entirely. Something cold moved through them, something patient and calculating and utterly without mercy. She had been dismissed, and Seraphine Ashcombe was not a woman who forgave dismissal. 2 floors below, in the servants' corridor, Isolde sat on the edge of her bed and stared at her ruined hands. The cracks were deeper now. 2 of her knuckles had swollen to twice their normal size. She flexed her fingers and watched the blood seep through skin that had given up trying to hold itself together. Nell appeared in the doorway. Hargrove wants to see you. Now? Now. Isolde stood, followed Nell through the corridor to the housekeeper's office, a small room that smelled of tallow and authority. Mrs. Hargrove sat behind her desk with her hands folded and her expression arranged in that particular configuration of displeasure that meant someone was about to be unmade. Close the door. Isolde closed it. Lady Ashcombe has requested a personal attendant for the duration of her visit. She has specifically requested you. The words landed in the pit of Isolde's stomach like stones dropped into dark water. Me, ma'am? You. I cannot imagine why. But Lady Ashcomb's requests are not optional. You will report to her chambers at 6 tomorrow morning. You will attend to her wardrobe, her correspondence, and whatever else she requires. You will continue your regular duties in addition to these new responsibilities. Is that clear? Ma'am, I am already working 17-hour. Is that clear? Isolde looked at the housekeeper, at the hard lines of a face that had been shaped by 30 years of serving people who viewed compassion as weakness and endurance as the minimum price of existence. Yes, ma'am. She walked back to her room, lay down on the narrow bed, pulled the thin blanket over her body, and stared at the ceiling. Somewhere above her, in the corridors she would never be permitted to walk as anything but a shadow, Lady Seraphine Ashcombe was pulling her closer. And Isolde understood with perfect, terrible clarity that the request had nothing to do with needing an attendant. It was a leash, and the woman holding the other end of it was already deciding exactly how hard to pull. 6 o'clock arrived before dawn had finished deciding whether it wanted to show up at all. Isolde was already dressed and moving through the servants' corridor with a candle she shielded against the drafts with one cupped hand when Nell caught her at the stairwell. Be careful with that one, Nell said, her voice barely above a breath. Lady Ashcombe had the last girl who attended her reassigned to the laundry after 3 days. Nobody knows what she did wrong. Nobody asked. Isolde looked at her. Was there anything wrong to begin with? Nell didn't answer, which was answer enough. The guest chambers on the second floor were a different country entirely from the servants' corridor. Carpet thick enough to muffle every footstep. Wallpaper in deep burgundy that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Doors that closed with a weight and precision that money had built into every hinge. Isolde knocked at the appointed door and waited. Come in. Seraphine was already awake and seated at the vanity. She had been awake for some time, Isolde could tell. The woman's composure was too complete for someone fresh out of sleep. She sat in a silk dressing robe the color of pale cream, her golden hair loose around her shoulders, studying her own reflection with the concentration of a general reviewing troop positions before a campaign. You are punctual, Seraphine said. Her eyes met Isolde's in the mirror without turning. I appreciate that. Thank you, my lady. The dress for this morning is on the chair. I require the laces tightened, the hair pinned in the French style, and fresh water for the basin before I sit. She paused. Can you manage the French style? Yes, my lady. Seraphine's eyes held her reflection a moment longer than necessary. We shall see. Isolde moved through the tasks. She poured the water, laid the dress, collected the combs. She had learned the French style from her mother, who had served in 3 houses before her back gave out. 27 pins, a specific rotation at the crown, 2 anchor points at the base. It was meticulous work. It required hands that did not shake. Her hands did not shake. When she finished, Seraphine turned her head left and right, examining the result with the critical detachment of someone who had been assessing other people's competence since childhood. Acceptable, she said. Better than my usual girl, actually. Another pause, measured, deliberate. You have good hands. For a servant. Thank you, my lady. Seraphine stood, let Isolde help her into the dress, and while the laces were being tightened, she spoke again with the airy carelessness of someone who had rehearsed the casualness very carefully. Did you sleep well last night? You look as though you did not. I slept fine, my lady. The sound carried nothing and implied everything. It must be difficult, all those long hours. Mrs. Hargrove works the new staff quite hard, I understand. The work is manageable. Of course it is. A girl with your constitution. Seraphine's eyes found Isolde's in the mirror again. Tell me, Isolde, how long have you been at Blackthorn Hall? 4 days, my lady. 4 days. Seraphine smiled, and already you have made an impression. The words landed with the weight of something Isolde was not supposed to hear directly. She kept her face clean of reaction, kept her hands moving over the lace. I try to do my work well, my lady. Yes. Seraphine's voice softened into something that felt more dangerous than sharpness. I'm sure you do. The morning stretched long and deliberate. Seraphine required her presence through breakfast, through the sitting room reading hour, through 2 letters that needed to be carried to the house steward. Every task was simple. Every instruction was civil. but there was a current running underneath all of it, something invisible and pressurized, the way air feels before lightning. Seraphine was building a picture. Every question she asked was a brushstroke. What corridors had Isolde cleaned? What hours had she worked? Had she seen the Duke at any point during the past 4 days? Had anyone spoken to her about the nature of her duties? Isolde answered each question with the truth trimmed down to its smallest possible size. Yes. No. Only to receive instructions about the hearths. Mrs. Hargrove manages the assignments. She gave nothing. And in giving nothing, she confirmed something. Because Seraphine's eyes got quieter and more focused with each answer, the way a hunter's eyes get quiet when the trail of something worth catching becomes clear. By mid-morning, Isolde had been dismissed until the afternoon dressing hour and was on her knees in the upper gallery with a brush and a bucket, when the sound of raised voices reached her from the study at the far end of the hall. She did not stop working, but her hands slowed and her hearing sharpened, and the words came through the closed door with the clarity that sound achieves in old stone houses built to amplify exactly nothing. Lord Ashcombe's voice. The delay is becoming embarrassing, Lucienne, for both families. 3 months since the original understanding was proposed. Parliament reconvenes in February. A man in your position, unmarried, with no declared heir, is a man whose choices are his own. Not at your level, not in this climate. A pause. Papers moving. The Ravenscar holdings are significant. Significant holdings without a succession plan make people nervous. Nervous people make decisions on your behalf. Is that what you want? Lucien's voice was quieter, which made it carry further. I want to have this conversation when you have a different argument. This is not about argument. This is about arithmetic. Seraphine is accomplished, well-connected, and I know what she is. Another pause. Longer. The quality of the silence between the two men had the specific texture of something that had been said before, in different words, across different tables, for years. Your father made alliances that protected this family for 2 generations, Adrian said. My father made alliances that killed him slowly, Lucien said. He traded every decision he made for consensus until there was nothing left of him that was actually him. He died in his own home without a single honest thought to his name. I watched it happen from the time I was 10 years old. I will not replicate it. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of history, of the particular violence that fathers visit on sons, by example, of the particular violence sons commit against fathers by refusing to repeat it. You will reconsider, Adrian said finally. His voice had dropped into something without warmth. Not a threat precisely, a statement about the shape of reality as he understood it. You will reconsider because you are not as invulnerable as you believe, and because I have resources you have not yet had to account for. Footsteps. A door. Isolde bent her head back to the floor and scrubbed with steady, methodical force, and did not look up when the study door opened and Lord Ashcombe walked past her without acknowledging her existence. In the study, Lucy stood at the window. The moor was white and flat and merciless under a sky the color of old bone. He pressed 2 fingers against the glass and felt the cold move through them and up into the joint of his wrist. He was losing patience with the performance of this visit. He had known, when he accepted the invitation to have Ashcombe's party arrive, that it would come to this: the veiled command dressed in the language of mutual benefit, the implication that refusal carried consequences. He had been receiving some version of this message since he was 22 years old when the first alliance proposal had arrived through a solicitor in London, and his father had looked at him across a dinner table with eyes that said, "This is how it works. This is how it has always worked. Be grateful you have the luxury of choosing which cage." He had refused then. He refused now. But Adrian's final words sat in his chest like a splinter driven too deep to reach with fingers. Resources you have not yet accounted for. That was not the language of a man making a social argument. That was the language of a man who had already moved pieces into position on a board that Lucien was only now realizing he had been playing. He needed to know what those pieces were. He turned from the window and pulled the bell for Voss. The afternoon session with Seraphine was worse than the morning. Isolde could feel the shift in temperature the moment she entered the chamber. Something had changed in the interval. Some decision had been made in rooms she was not permitted to occupy. And whatever it was had tightened Seraphine's composure to the point where it was no longer composure, but pressure wearing composure's face. The evening gown tonight, Seraphine said. The silver. And I want the necklace from the blue case. The sapphires. She was standing at the window, watching the snow, and she did not turn when she spoke. "Did you encounter anyone in the upper gallery this morning?" "No, my lady." "No one walking the corridor?" "Lord Ashcombe passed by, my lady. He did not stop." Seraphine turned. Her eyes moved over Isolde with that measuring quality that never quite became obvious enough to name. "I see." She crossed to the vanity and sat, and Isolde began the work of the evening pins. "You are a quiet girl. I appreciate that. Chatty servants are exhausting." A pause. "Though sometimes quiet is its own kind of noise, isn't it?" Isolde set a pin, said nothing. "It does." "There are girls in service," Seraphine continued, "who mistake proximity to power for power itself, who are in a room for 5 minutes and begin to believe they belong there." She watched her own reflection as she spoke, and the words came out with the smooth inevitability of something that had been building to this sentence for hours. It never ends well for them. Not because anyone acts against them specifically, simply because the world has an order, and things that step outside that order create friction. And friction destroys the weaker element, always. Isolde's hands were steady on the pins. Her voice was level. "That seems like a reasonable thing to understand, my lady." Seraphine's eyes found hers in the mirror. Something moved in them. Surprise, recalibration, the fractional adjustment of a person who expected to land a blow and instead hit resistance. "Yes," Seraphine said softly. "It does." The dinner that evening was quieter than the night before. 4 at the table instead of 12. Lucien, Adrian, Seraphine, and Sir Percival, whose primary contribution to the evening was refilling his wine glass at intervals that suggested either extraordinary thirst or extraordinary boredom. The conversation moved through the formal channels of aristocratic dinner talk: the weather, the state of northern roads, a hunting party someone had attended in November that apparently went badly. Isolde served and withdrew and served again. She was learning the table's rhythm now. Who needed refills before they asked? Where to stand to be invisible? How to move so that the serving became part of the room's texture rather than an interruption of it? She was at the sideboard when Seraphine said, in the light tone of someone who had calculated the angle very carefully, "Father, did you know that His Grace's new kitchen girl walked 7 miles through the snow to reach Blackthorn Hall on her first day? Isn't that remarkable determination?" The temperature of the room did not change. Nothing visible changed. But Isolde felt Lucien's attention shift, felt it the way you feel weather changing, some pressure differential moving through the air before any visible sign appears. Adrian looked up from his plate, found Isolde at the sideboard with the expressionless precision of a man locating something he had previously noted as relevant. "Is that so?" he said. Seraphine smiled. "Mrs. Hargrove tells me she has exceptional hands. Very useful girl." "I imagine she is," Adrian said. His voice held nothing. That was the worst part of it. Not contempt, not malice, just the flat assessment of someone weighing an object and determining its function. Lucien's voice came across the table without inflection. "Miss Vale is a member of this household's staff. Her journey to the estate was her own affair and is not a subject for dinner conversation." The sentence dropped into the room and lay there. Nobody moved the silverware. Nobody refilled a glass. Seraphine turned her gaze to Lucien. Her expression did not break. "Of course, Your Grace. I only meant to compliment the girl's character." "She does not require your compliments." Lucien lifted his wine glass. "She requires decent working hours and fair treatment, which she will have." The pause that followed was 4 seconds long. In those 4 seconds, everything shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, in the way continental plates shift, deep, invisible, irreversible. Adrian Ashcombe set down his fork. His eyes moved from his daughter to the Duke and back with the practiced economy of a man filing documents. His expression remained perfectly civil, but behind it, Isolde could see the quiet machinery of reassessment grinding forward. Sir Percival filled his wine glass. Isolde moved from the sideboard to the table, poured water for Seraphine with a hand that did not tremble, and stepped back into invisibility. But she felt Lucien's gaze touch the side of her face for the briefest fraction of a second as she retreated. Not lingering, not obvious. A fragment of attention so small it was almost nothing. Almost. After dinner, Isolde was washing glasses in the scullery when Nell came in fast and closed the door behind her with both hands. "Hargrove got a note," Nell said. Her voice was taut. "From Lady Ashcombe." Isolde kept washing. What kind of note? The kind with instructions. She's requesting you be relieved of the personal attendant position tomorrow. Nell hesitated. And reassigned to the laundry. The laundry? 3 floors below the main house. Stone floor, wet cold. 12-hour shifts in steam so thick it was half water. The kind of reassignment that was not a reassignment. It was an erasure. A way of burying someone so deep in the house they stopped existing. Isolde set the glass down on the drying cloth. Her hands were still. Her reflection in the dark window above the basin was thin and sharp, and looked like someone who had been expecting this since the moment Seraphine smiled at her in the corridor on the first morning. "When did the note arrive?" she said. "An hour ago. Hargrove hasn't responded yet, but you know she will. She always does what the guests request." Isolde stared at her reflection. Outside, the snow was falling again, thick and silent, covering the world in a quiet that had nothing to do with peace. Seraphine had made her move, not loud, not visible, just the quiet tightening of fingers around something that could not fight back. A girl who had no position, no patron, no one who would notice when she disappeared into the machine of the house and did not come back out. The friction, Seraphine had said, always destroys the weaker element. Isolde picked up the next glass. Dried it, set it on the shelf. Her jaw was set. Her breathing was even. And behind her eyes, something that had been simmering since the first morning, since the vanity mirror and the silk robe and the words precise as pins, finally stopped simmering and went still in the way that things go still just before they decide to move. She was not done yet. What she did not know, what she could not have known in that stone-floored scullery with her cracked hands and her extinguished candle, was that 40 feet above her, Lucien Ravenscar was standing in the corridor outside Voss's office, having just read 3 documents that Adrian Ashcombe had not meant him to find. 3 documents that mapped out, in the clean, cold language of legal transaction, a plan to acquire the Ravenscar Northern Holdings through parliamentary pressure, reputational damage, and a forced marriage contract that had been drafted 3 months before any proposal had officially been made. A plan that required only one thing to execute, a scandal. And Lord Ashcombe, Lucia now understood with perfect and terrible clarity, had already begun manufacturing one. The documents were not hidden. That was the first thing that told Lucien the situation was worse than a simple scheme. Hidden documents meant caution. Documents left in a traveling case that a valet had left unlocked, in a guest room that a steward had entered to replace the coal, found by accident and delivered to the Duke, with the nervous efficiency of a man who understood that information in this house moved upward or it moved nowhere. Those documents meant confidence. Adrian Ashcombe had not been careful with these papers because Adrian Ashcombe had not believed he needed to be. That was the second thing that told Lucien how bad it was. The man was not afraid of being caught, which meant he believed the trap was already closed. Lucien stood in Voss's office and read the 3 pages again. The language was legal and clean. A petition to the Parliamentary Committee on Estates and Succession, citing the Ravenscar holdings as a concern of national economic stability given the Duke's unmarried status. And this was the phrase that drove something cold and precise into the base of Lucien's skull, given recent evidence of conduct unbecoming the management of a significant hereditary estate. Recent evidence. He set the pages on Voss's desk. The fire in the grate was low. Voss stood across from him with his hands at his sides and the expression of a man who had already done his grieving for the situation and was now simply waiting for instructions. "When did you find these?" Lucien said. "This evening, during the coal replacement. Pemberton brought them directly to me." "Has anyone else seen them?" "No, Your Grace." "Has Ashcombe given any indication he knows they were found?" "None. He retired at 9. He appeared comfortable." Lucien looked at the fire. Comfortable. The word landed with the specific weight of a man who had set something in motion and gone to bed knowing it was working. The conduct reference. What is he building toward? Voss was quiet for a moment. Then, "There has been talk, Your Grace. Below stairs. I did not bring it to you because I considered it the ordinary churn of servant gossip. But given what we are looking at, tell me." "Lady Ashcombe's maid has been asking questions of the junior staff, specifically about your schedule, your movements at night, whether you have been seen in corridors after hours." Another pause. "Whether any of the new girls have been seen in parts of the house they should not be in." The cold thing at the base of Lucien's skull drove itself another inch deeper. He understood now. The full architecture of it, the genius of its simplicity. A servant girl found in the Duke's bedroom. It did not matter that nothing had happened. It did not matter what the truth was. In the world Adrian Ashcombe navigated, truth was a raw material. You took it, you shaped it, and you made it into whatever the argument required. A scandal. Not a real one. A manufactured one. A servant girl with no position, no family with influence, no one to contradict the story once it was told. And the story, once told in the right rooms to the right people, would do exactly what Ashcombe needed it to do. Compromise Lucian's standing, manufacture the instability the parliamentary petition was already describing, and create a situation in which marrying Seraphine Ashcombe became not an alliance, but a rescue. He had walked into it, stood beside the fire and watched her sleep, and walked directly into the most elegant trap he had ever underestimated. "Where is Miss Vale now?" he said. "The scullery, I believe. Evening clean-up." "Bring her to the east sitting room, not through the main corridor, through the service passage." Voss did not ask why. He left. Lucien folded the documents into his coat pocket and stood alone in the office for 30 seconds. He was not a man who wasted time on emotions that did not serve function. He had learned that early and practiced it long. But what moved through him now was not quite anger and not quite fear. It was something colder than both. The recognition of a man who has spent his whole life building walls and has just discovered that someone tunneled under them while he was standing on top looking the other way. He had let something in. For the first time in years, he had let something register on him. A girl with cracked hands and 7 miles of snow behind her and enough spine to hold her face together in front of a woman like Seraphine Ashcombe. And the moment he did, the world had found the gap and was already forcing itself through. He walked to the east sitting room and waited. She came in still wearing her work apron, her hair coming loose from its pin on one side, a red mark on her right wrist from the washing water. She stopped when she saw him. Her face went through 3 calculations in under 2 seconds. Surprise, wariness, the settling of something careful over whatever was underneath, and then she was still. "Your Grace?" "Sit down, Miss Vale." She sat on the edge of the chair across from him. Her posture was straight despite the exhaustion visible in every other line of her. He had noticed this about her. The way she carried her spine like it was the one thing nobody had managed to take from her yet. He did not sit. He stood by the window with the documents in his hand and looked at her directly. "I am going to ask you one question, and I need the precise truth. Not the careful version, the actual one." Her eyes held his. "All right. When you were in my room the other night, did anyone see you enter? Did anyone see you leave?" Something moved through her face, not guilt. She had nothing to be guilty of. Something worse. Recognition. The expression of a person who has been trying not to look at a specific wall because they already know what's written on it. "I don't know who might have been in the corridor," she said. I wasn't thinking clearly by that point. I was running on nothing." She stopped. Then, "Lady Ashcombe's maid has the room at the end of that hall." The confirmation sat in the air between them like smoke. "She has been asking questions about you," Lucien said. "About your movements. The information will be used to suggest that what occurred between us was something other than what it was." Isolde's jaw tightened. The red mark on her wrist stood out against pale skin. "There was nothing between us." "I know that." "Then, it doesn't matter what I know." His voice came out harder than he intended. Not at her. At the situation. At the shape of a world that ran on narrative rather than fact and always had. What matters is what can be made to appear credible to people who already want to believe it. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped to something stripped of pretense. "She told me this morning that friction always destroys the weaker element. I thought she meant it as a general philosophy." "She meant it as a schedule." Isolde looked at her hands, at the cracks that had not healed and would not heal as long as she was doing the work she was doing. Then she looked back up, and there was something in her eyes that Lucien had not expected. Not fear, not resignation, but a kind of focused, cold-burning clarity. The look of someone who has been told the exact nature of the danger and has decided that information is a tool rather than a sentence. "What do you want me to do?" she said. The question hit him somewhere he had not prepared for. Not because it was complicated. Because of how she asked it. Not with helplessness, not with the deference of someone waiting to be moved around a board. She asked it the way a soldier asks for orders. Squared up. Present. ready for the answer to be hard. "Nothing yet," he said. "Stay away from Lady Ashcomb's corridor. If anyone asks you about that night, you were cleaning the East Wing guest rooms and you have nothing further to add. Do not elaborate. Do not defend yourself. Say less than you think you need to." She nodded. "And Miss Vale?" He paused. The words that came next were not planned. He was not a man who said unplanned things. But the moment had its own gravity, and he moved with it rather than against it, which was itself a thing he had never done before. "This is not your fault. I want that understood." She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Whatever she saw in his face made something in her own shift. Not relief, not gratitude. Something more fundamental than either. Like a person who has been carrying an extra weight so long they stop noticing it, and only register it's gone when they feel the absence. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said quietly. She stood. Left. The door closed without a sound. Lucian stood at the window for a long time after. The next morning moved on a surface that looked normal from any angle that didn't know where to look. Breakfast served on time. Conversation at the table proceeding through the usual channels. Adrian Ashcombe discussing the parliamentary session with the focused energy of a man who had slept well and felt the day going exactly as he expected. Lucian watched him. He had spent the hours before dawn reconstructing the timeline, when the documents must have been drafted, what sequence of events they required, what Ashcombe needed to put in motion before the end of this visit. The scandal had to break before the petition was submitted. It had to be fresh. Recent evidence, the petition read. That meant Ashcombe needed the story told and circulating in the right circles before he returned to London, which meant it was going to happen today or tomorrow, not later. He excused himself from the table at 9:30, citing estate correspondence, and spent 45 minutes in the study writing 2 letters, one to his solicitor in London and one to a man named Hartwell, who had worked for the Ravenscar family in parliamentary affairs for 12 years and understood the architecture of those particular halls better than most of their permanent residents. He sealed both letters and handed them to Voss personally. He was coming back through the main corridor when he heard Seraphine's voice from the drawing room. Not words, just the particular music of it that controlled descending cadence she used when she was performing graciousness for an audience. He stopped. Through the half-open door he heard a second voice. Mrs. Hargrove. "The reassignment will be effective tomorrow morning. I have already notified the laundry supervisor." "Good." Seraphine's voice was satisfied. Not pleased. Satisfied, which was different. Pleasure is a reaction. Satisfaction is a plan completing its final stage. "And the other matter I mentioned last evening. I have prepared the account as requested, my lady. In writing, it details the relevant observations made by the night staff." "Excellent. I will need it before dinner." A pause, then Hargrove. "My lady, I want to ensure I have understood correctly. This account, it will be used. It will be used to protect this household from an inappropriate situation that could embarrass everyone in it if left unaddressed." Seraphine's voice went gentle and final, in the same stroke. "You are doing the right thing, Mrs. Hargrove. Blackthorn Hall requires a certain standard of conduct from all its members. You understand that better than anyone." Footsteps. Lucian stepped back from the doorway and stood against the wall as Mrs. Hargrove emerged, tucked something small against her chest, and moved away down the corridor without looking left or right. He waited until her footsteps faded. Then he pushed the drawing room door open and walked in. Seraphine was at the window, looking out at the snow-covered moor with the composure of someone who had just finished a task she had been building toward for days. She turned when she heard him, and her face arranged itself into something that managed to look simultaneously warm and cautious, a performance so refined it had probably taken years to perfect. "Your Grace, I did not hear you approach." "I know you did not." He crossed the room and stopped 6 feet from her, too close for social comfort, far enough that it could not be called anything but deliberate. "I'm going to give you one opportunity to be honest with me. I would encourage you to take it." Her expression did not break, but her breath shifted, a single involuntary change in rhythm that his eyes caught and filed. "I'm not sure what you mean." "The account Mrs. Hargrove is preparing, the petition your father filed in draft 3 months ago. The specific timing of this visit relative to both." He let the silence sit for 2 seconds. "I mean all of it." Seraphine looked at him. For the first time since he had known her, he saw something genuine move through her face. Not guilt, not fear exactly, but the recalibration of a person who has been operating on the assumption that a door was closed and has just heard it open. You found the documents. Your father should have locked his case. My father, she said slowly, does not believe he needs to. I am aware of what your father believes. I am asking about what you believe. He held her gaze. Is this what you want, Lady Ashcombe? A marriage built on a manufactured ruin. A husband who arrived at the altar because the alternative was a parliamentary petition and a scandal your family constructed from a servant girl's exhaustion. Something flashed across her face. Real this time. Too fast to dissect, but real. A crack in the porcelain wide enough to see that whatever was underneath was not simple. You defended her at dinner, Seraphine said. Her voice had changed. The music was gone. What remained was something thinner and more honest. In front of my father, in front of everyone. A kitchen girl. You stopped a conversation to make a point about a kitchen girl's working hours. I stopped a conversation because a member of my household was being used as a social instrument at my table. Is that all she is to you? The question came out sharp. Sharper than she had intended, probably. An instrument. Lucien looked at her. At the woman behind the performance. The one who had apparently been watching his reactions closely enough to notice something she had filed as a threat before he had named it to himself. What is said or felt in this house is not your concern. It became my concern, Seraphine said quietly, when it became the reason you looked at her instead of looking at me. The honesty of it stopped him. Not because it changed anything, because it was the first true sentence she had spoken to him in 4 days. I am sorry, he said, and he meant it. I'm sorry that this was the arrangement you were placed in. I'm sorry that your worth was translated into a contract before anyone asked you what you wanted. That was not fair to you. He paused. But I will not be maneuvered into a life by manufactured evidence and parliamentary pressure, and any path forward that begins that way ends badly for everyone on it, including you. Seraphine stood very still. Something in her face worked through itself slowly. The collapse of an architecture she had been maintaining for months, or perhaps years, the specific exhaustion of a woman who has been performing a strategy so long she has forgotten what she was performing it for. My father will not withdraw the petition, she said finally. No, he will not. Lucien held her gaze. But I will. He turned and left the room. In the corridor, he walked with the focused speed of a man who has finally accepted that the defensive position is no longer viable and has committed to something entirely different. He had spent years governing through distance, managing, controlling, keeping every relationship at the arm's length required to ensure nothing and no one could be used against him. He had believed this was intelligence. He was now understanding it was just a longer road to the same destination. Distance did not protect you. It only guaranteed you were alone when the trap closed. He was 3 steps from Voss's office when he heard it, a sound from the direction of the servants' stairwell, something between a stumble and a controlled fall, and then Nell's voice pitched high with alarm. He turned. Nell was at the base of the stairwell, one hand braced against the wall, and she was looking up at the landing above where Isolde stood gripping the rail with both hands, her face the color of unfinished plaster, her breath coming in rapid, shallow pulls that were wrong. Too fast, too thin, the breathing of a body that had been running on empty for days and had just tried to cash a check the account could not cover. Lucien crossed the corridor in 12 steps. Miss Vale? Her eyes found him. They were glassy at the edges. Not tears, fever. He recognized it. He had seen the same look on men who had pushed themselves past the body's honest limits and were standing on the far side of the line that divided working through it from going down hard. I am fine, she said. Her voice was steady. Her legs were not. You are not fine. He looked at Nell. Get Mrs. Harding from the kitchen, now. Your Grace, I can... Isolde started. Stop talking. He moved up 2 steps and put his hand under her elbow. The heat coming off her skin through the fabric of her dress was substantial, high enough to notice through a layer of wool. She had been burning this for hours, maybe longer, and kept working anyway because in this house, stopping meant consequences she could not afford. Can you walk? Yes. Then walk. He guided her off the stairwell and into the corridor, his hand staying under her elbow, because her gait was wrong in a way that told him she was compensating for something she was not saying. Behind him, he heard Nell's quick footsteps retreating toward the kitchen. They were halfway down the corridor when the drawing room door opened and Seraphine stepped into the hallway. She took in the scene, Lucien, his hand on the servant girl's arm, walking her with the focused deliberateness of a man who had made a decision, and her face went through something complex and final. Not rage, something quieter and more permanent than rage. Lucien met her eyes for 1 second. He did not stop walking. Behind the closed door at the end of the hall, he settled Isolde into a chair by the fire in the small sitting room adjacent to the servants' kitchen. She sat without protest, which told him everything about how bad it actually was. Isolde Vale did not accept help without argument unless she had run out of argument entirely. He crouched in front of her and looked at her face directly. The fever was sitting at a level that required attention. Her hands in her lap were trembling with the fine vibration of a body conserving heat it no longer had reserves to generate. "How long?" he said. She knew what he meant. "Since yesterday morning, maybe the night before." "You worked a full day with a fever. There was no one else to do the work." She said it simply, not defensively, as a statement of mechanical fact. This was how it had always worked. The invisible girl who keeps moving because the world only notices her when she stops, and then only to be annoyed at the interruption. The philosophy was not written anywhere she could point to. It was just the architecture of her entire existence, so deeply structural she had mistaken it for the nature of reality. Lucien looked at her for a long moment, at the cracked hands and the fever-bright eyes and the spine that was still straight even now, even in this, even after all of it. Something settled in him. Not dramatically, quietly. The way the deepest decisions always settle. Not with fire, but with the simple, irreversible click of a door that is finally closed on an old room. He stood up, turned to the doorway where Mrs. Harding had just arrived, breathless and alarmed, and behind her Voss, and behind Voss at the far end of the corridor in the shadows where the lamplight did not reach, the still figure of Adrian Ashcombe, watching with eyes that had just finished calculating exactly what he was looking at. Lucien met the man's gaze across the length of the corridor. Adrian did not move, did not speak, just looked, with the slow, satisfied expression of a man watching a clock tick toward the hour he had set it for. Lucien held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he turned back to Mrs. Harding. "Have the blue room on the second floor prepared. Miss Vale will rest there until the fever breaks. She is not to be assigned any duties until I say otherwise. If anyone in this household questions that instruction, direct them to me." Mrs. Harding stared at him. Voss stared at him. From somewhere above them, from the corridor outside the drawing room where Seraphine had watched them pass, came the sound of a door closing. Quiet. Final. "Your Grace," Voss said carefully, "the blue room is— I know what room it is." Down the corridor, Adrian Ashcombe's expression shifted from satisfaction into something new, something that had not been there before. Because for the first time since he had arrived at Blackthorn Hall, the Duke of Ravenscar had done something that was not a defense. He had moved forward. And Adrian Ashcombe, who had spent 30 years studying the anatomy of power, understood with cold and sudden clarity that a man who stops defending and starts choosing is a man who has decided he has nothing left to lose. Which meant the trap had not closed. It had opened. The blue room had not been used in 3 years. Lucien knew this because he knew every room in Blackthorn Hall, the way a man knows the interior of his own chest. Not from tenderness, but from the long familiarity of living inside something without ever fully examining it. The room had belonged to his mother. After she died, it had been kept clean and sealed, a space the household moved around without entering, the way people move around grief without naming it. He had chosen it without thinking. That fact settled into him somewhere between giving the order and watching Mrs. Harding's face cycle through shock and compliance, and he did not examine it closely. There was no time to examine anything closely. Adrian Ashcombe was standing at the end of that corridor, and the clock that had been running since Voss laid those 3 documents on the desk was now running very fast indeed. He left Isolde in Mrs. Harding's care. She had stopped arguing, which meant the fever had consumed whatever reserve of resistance she had been running on, and walked back down the corridor toward Voss. "Get Hartwell's reply before it reaches the regular post," he said quietly. "Intercept anything addressed to London from within this house. Anyone in the guest party attempting to dispatch a letter today does not dispatch it today." Voss's expression did not change. "Understood. And find out who on the night staff gave Mrs. Hargrove the written account." "Already working on it, Your Grace." He walked past Voss and did not look back at the place where Adrian Ashcombe had been standing. The man was gone. That was worse than if he had stayed. A man who retreats after watching you make a move is a man who already knows his next 3. The morning hours moved with the deceptive calm of weather before a system arrives. Lucien worked through estate correspondence with mechanical efficiency, signing what needed to be signed, deferring nothing, leaving no loose ends that could become handles. He had learned this from his father, who had been disastrously good at the performance of control and catastrophically bad at the actual thing, and from watching that performance collapse in real time across the last decade of the man's life. Lucien had taken the lesson in reverse. The paperwork was not control, but the absence of paperwork was chaos, and chaos was what men like Adrian Ashcombe ate for breakfast. At 11, Seraphine knocked at the study door. He had been expecting her father. Her arrival recalibrated something. He set down his pen. "Come in." She entered without the usual performance. No arranged expression, no silk over glass voice. She closed the door behind her and stood in the middle of the room, looking at him with the face of a woman who has burned through the last of something she had been rationing for a long time. "My father is writing to London," she said. "He sent Pemberton out the back way with a letter 40 minutes ago. I don't know what it says." Lucy Tien looked at her. "Why are you telling me this?" The question was genuine, not a challenge. It landed in the room and sat there, and Seraphine held it without flinching, which was the most honest thing he had seen her do since she arrived. "Because last night I told myself a story about what I wanted," she said, "and this morning I stopped believing it." A pause. The kind that costs something. "She is genuinely ill, you know that. She worked herself into a fever in this house, and nobody in this house noticed, because nobody in this house was supposed to notice. That was by design. My design, and my father's design, and Mrs. Hargrove's compliance, and—" She stopped. Her hands were still at her sides. "I am not my father. I told you that, and I had not yet decided if it was true. I have decided now." Lucien studied her. He was not a man who trusted sudden conversions. The architecture of the world he had been raised in ran on calculated betrayal, dressed as loyalty, and he had learned to keep his weight off anything that had not been tested. But Seraphine Ashcombe was standing in the middle of his study without any of her armor on, and the effort that was costing her was visible in every line of her face. "Where did Pemberton go?" he said. "The East Road, toward Renford." He stood, moved to the door and opened it. Voss was in the corridor. Had been there, Lucien suspected, since before Seraphine arrived. "The East Road to Renford. Now." Voss moved. Lucien turned back to Seraphine. "I am going to ask you to stay in your chambers until this afternoon, not as a slight, because what happens in the next several hours will be cleaner if you are not in the room for it." She looked at him. Something in her eyes was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "He will not forgive this." "No. He will say I betrayed the family." "He will. And I will have to live with that." Lucien held her gaze. "Yes, you will." He paused. "You will also have to live with the alternative." She left. He stood at the window and gave himself 30 seconds to run the entire sequence forward. What Ashcombe had sent, what it would set in motion, how fast it could be answered, what the answer needed to accomplish. 30 seconds. He had made larger decisions in less. He put on his coat and went downstairs. The morning room held the remnants of mid-morning tea. Adrian Ashcombe sat in the chair nearest the fire with a newspaper folded in his lap and an expression of elaborate leisure that was the most expensive performance Lucien had seen since Parliament last sat. Sir Percival was at the window. Both men looked up when Lucien entered. "Lucien." Adrian's voice carried all its usual warmth, which was to say, the simulation of warmth with the boiler showing underneath. "I was wondering when you would join us." Lucien crossed the room and sat down. He took the chair directly across from Adrian, and he sat in it the way a man sits in a position he intends to hold, weight forward, hands open on the arms, eyes level. He did not speak immediately. He let the silence grow for 5 full seconds, while he looked at the man who had come into his house with a 3-month-old trap and the patience to spring it slowly. Adrian's newspaper lowered by a fraction. "Your letter to London," Lucien said, "will not arrive." The room temperature did not change. Adrian's expression did not change. But something behind his eyes recalculated with a speed that confirmed everything. The man had not expected to be in this conversation yet. He had expected another 18 hours, maybe 24. "I beg your pardon. Pemberton is on the East Road. My steward is faster and knows the terrain better. The letter will be intercepted before it reaches the post." Lucien kept his voice even. Not cold, not heated. The specific register of a man who has moved past the point where temperature is useful. I want to be transparent about that. I want to be transparent about the 3 documents that were found in your traveling case. And I want to be transparent about what I intend to do about all of it, so there is no later conversation where you claim to have been surprised. Sir Percival set down his cup. Adrian folded the newspaper in half with the careful deliberateness of a man who needs his hands to be doing something while his mind runs through options. You have been through my personal correspondence, Adrian said. Your personal correspondence was found by my staff in an unlocked case in a room belonging to my estate. I own the room, Adrian. I own everything in it until your departure. That is a remarkable interpretation of hospitality. It is the correct one. Lucien leaned forward slightly. You wrote a parliamentary petition 3 months before this visit. You cited evidence that did not yet exist, which means you came here to manufacture it. You deployed your daughter and my housekeeper and the specific timing of your arrival to create a compromising appearance around a member of my staff, who has done nothing except work herself into a fever in my house, while your daughter arranged her reassignment to the laundry. Adrian's face had gone very still. The leisure had burned off entirely, the way fog burns off when the temperature rises enough, and what was underneath was what had always been underneath. The face of a man who has operated in rooms of real consequence for 3 decades, and has never lost a fight he started because he has never started a fight he had not already won. You are describing a conspiracy, Adrian said. I am describing what happened. You are describing the overprotective reaction of a man who has developed an inappropriate attachment to a servant girl and is now constructing a narrative to justify it. Adrian's voice was almost gentle. That was the technique, the softening of the accusation to make the target feel that the problem is their own perception rather than the reality. I say this with genuine concern, Lucien. You are a man of significant position. The Ravenscar name carries 300 years of history. What I have observed in the past 48 hours, the dinner conversation, the corridor this morning, the assignment of your mother's chambers to a kitchen girl, these are not the actions of a man thinking clearly. Lucien looked at him. He felt the pull of the argument, not its truth, but its engineering, the precision of it. The way it took a real thing, the fact that Isolde had registered on him in ways he had not fully named, and weaponized it by making the registration itself the scandal. He understood, sitting in that chair, exactly what his father had never understood, that the most effective trap is not the one that manufactures something from nothing, but the one that finds the real thing and reshapes it until you cannot tell your own genuine impulse from the crime they have made it into. He was not his father. I am thinking more clearly than I have in years, Lucien said, and I will tell you exactly what happens now. You will withdraw the petition. You will do so before you leave this estate. I have a solicitor in London who will verify the withdrawal within 48 hours. In return, I will not pursue the question of how my housekeeper came to prepare a written account of private household observations for the use of a guest. I will not raise the question of whether the Ashcombe family engaged in deliberate manipulation of my staff, and I will not bring the documents before the same parliamentary committee you intended to submit them to, along with a documented account of their premature existence. The silence in the room had a quality now. Dense, pressurized. The silence of 2 structures under load testing which one holds. Adrian looked at him for a long time. You are threatening me. I am offering you an exit. Lucien held his gaze without blinking. There is a difference. Threats leave marks on both people. Exits are clean. I am offering you the clean version because I do not want a war with your family. I want you to leave my house with your holdings intact, your daughter's reputation undamaged, and the understanding that Blackthorn Hall and the Ravenscar name are not a resource to be acquired. Sir Percival had gone very quiet in his corner. He had the look of a man who had attended what he believed was a social visit, and found himself watching something that would be spoken of in drawing rooms for years. Adrian Ashcombe unfolded his newspaper, smoothed it against his knee. The gesture was controlled, and the control was the most revealing thing about it. Only a man working very hard at composure needs to smooth paper that is already flat. I will need until this evening, he said, to consider my response. You have until dinner, Lucien said. He stood. If you would like to walk the gallery before then, please feel free. Blackthorn Hall is at your disposal. He looked at the man who had built a cage around him before he arrived and intended to lock it by the time he left. For the remainder of your visit. He walked out. In the corridor, he stood for a moment with his back against the wall and breathed. His pulse was running fast. Not from fear, from the specific adrenaline of a man who has gone off the defended ground and committed to an open field and cannot yet see what is coming at him from the direction he cannot cover. He had made the offer. Adrian would calculate. He would weigh the documents, the solicitor's involvement, the question of Seraphine's defection. He would run every line of the argument, and he would reach the same place all men reach when the exit is genuinely cleaner than the fight. Or he would not, and then it would become something else. Lucian pushed off the wall and walked toward the blue room. She was awake, sitting up against the headboard with a blanket pulled across her lap, and a glass of water she had clearly been told to drink and had been drinking with the resigned compliance of someone who has decided arguing is no longer worth the energy. The fever had come down slightly. Her color was better. The glassiness at the edges of her eyes had pulled back into something more present. She looked at him when he entered, and her expression moved through the now familiar sequence. Wariness, calculation, settling. "You don't have to check on me," she said. "I know I don't." He sat in the chair beside the bed. Mrs. Harding had left a lamp burning, and the room had the quiet of a space that had been sealed and opened and was still deciding what it wanted to be. "How bad is the fever?" "Mrs. Harding says it's breaking. I'll be functional by tomorrow. You will rest until I say otherwise." She looked at him with an expression that was trying to be annoyed and landing somewhere closer to grateful. "There are rooms that need... There are people who can cover those rooms. You are not the only staff in this house." He held her gaze. "You have been acting like you are. You are not." Something moved through her face. Not quite emotion, more like the echo of emotion, the place where it had been before she learned not to show it. She looked at her hands on the blanket, at the cracks that had begun, slightly, to heal with a day of warmth and rest. "What happened with Lord Ashcombe?" she said. "It is being managed." "That's not an answer." "It is the one I have right now." He paused. "The account Mrs. Hargrove prepared. About the night you were found in my room. It will not leave this estate." She was quiet. Then, "She will try again." "She won't have the opportunity." Isolde looked at him directly. There was something in her eyes that had not been there on the first night. Not trust exactly, because trust was a thing that built slowly in a person who had earned every lesson about why it shouldn't, but something adjacent to it, something that moved in the same direction. "Why are you doing this?" she said. Genuinely. Not the answer about household management or appropriate conduct. Why? The question sat in the room. Lucian looked at her, at the girl who had walked 7 miles through snow to a house that did not know she existed, who had held her spine straight through everything this household had put through it, who had asked him what she could do rather than what he was going to do for her. And he felt the wall shift again. Further this time. Further than it had moved in years. "Because," he said, "I have spent a very long time running this estate as though the people inside it were furniture. And you are not furniture," he paused. "And because someone in this house should have noticed a long time before I did." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have said true things and are letting them stand. He left before it became something he could not walk back from. Not because he wanted to, because the afternoon required him elsewhere, and because there was a version of this that could only survive being built slowly, and he was not yet certain the foundation would hold the weight of what he was starting to understand he felt. At 4 o'clock, Voss appeared at his study door. Pemberton had been intercepted. The letter was in Voss's hand, sealed, unread, held by the corner with the careful neutrality of a man who understood that what he was carrying was either the end of one thing or the beginning of something worse. Lucian looked at it. Then he looked at Voss. "Lock it in the safe. Don't open it." "Your Grace." "If Ashcombe withdraws the petition, the letter is returned to him unopened. That is the deal. I keep my end." He turned back to the window. "Has he asked to see me?" "Not yet, Your Grace." "He will. Before dinner." He was right. At 5:15, Adrian Ashcombe appeared at the study door. He came in without the newspaper, without Sir Percival, without any of the accessories of the performance he had been running since he arrived. Just the man himself, older than he looked in company, a little thinner through the shoulders, without the fullness of authority around him. He sat down across from Lucien without being invited to, and laced his hands on the desk between them. "I have one condition," he said. Lucien waited. Seraphine is not to be named in any account of this. Whatever is documented, whatever your solicitor holds, her name appears nowhere. Lucien looked at him. At the man who had used his daughter as the sharpest instrument in a complicated operation, and was now, at the very end of it, asking that she be protected from the consequences of that use. The contradiction was not lost on either of them. Adrian's jaw was set in a way that made him look, briefly, like a man who had found the one thing he could not negotiate around and was furious at himself for having it. Agreed, Lucien said. Adrian nodded. Once. The nod of a man closing a door he had spent months building and would not see open again. I will have the withdrawal drafted tonight. I will need the signed document before your departure tomorrow morning. Another nod. Adrian stood. He was halfway to the door when he stopped, did not turn, spoke to the air in front of him with a voice stripped of every layer of strategy. She is more like her mother than I have allowed myself to see, he said. Her mother would not have gone through with it either. He left. The dinner that evening was the quietest meal Blackthorn Hall had hosted in years. 4 at the table again, but the weight distribution had shifted entirely. Adrian ate methodically and spoke little. Sir Percival had apparently decided the safest policy was complete silence and implemented it with impressive consistency. Seraphine sat across from her father with the particular stillness of a woman who has crossed a line she cannot uncross and is learning in real time what the other side feels like. Lucien sat at the head of the table and watched all of it and said what was required to maintain the surface of a functioning meal and thought about a girl 3 floors up drinking water in his mother's room. At 9 o'clock he dismissed the table. As the guests moved toward the corridor, he stopped Seraphine with a quiet word. He agreed to the condition. She looked at him. Her eyes were bright with something she was working not to show. Thank you. Your name stays out of it. That was what mattered. She nodded. Then quietly, I hope she recovers quickly. She left. Lucien stood alone in the dining room. The candles had burned low. The fire was ash and orange. Outside the tall windows, the snow had started again. Heavy, silent, covering everything that had been uncovered and replacing it with the clean blankness of a world that did not carry its own history on its surface. He had done it. The trap was dismantled. The petition would be withdrawn. The document was in the safe. By tomorrow morning, Adrian Ashcombe and his party would be on the road south, and Blackthorn Hall would belong to itself again. He should have felt the release of that. He had felt the release of difficult things before. Closed negotiations, ended legal threats, managed crises. The body had a specific response to resolution. He knew it well. He did not feel it. What he felt instead was the thing he had been circling for 4 days without naming. The reason he had stood by the fire and watched her sleep instead of calling Voss. The reason the word furniture had come out of his mouth in the blue room with the specific weight of a confession. The reason the silence in this house felt different than it had a week ago, and he could not make it stop feeling different no matter how much structure and strategy he put between himself and that difference. He picked up the last candle from the table and walked toward the door. He was 3 steps into the corridor when he heard it, running footsteps, light and urgent, and then Nell appeared at the far end of the hall, with her face the color of old chalk. Your Grace! Her voice was tight. Miss Vale? She's gone. He went still. What do you mean, gone? Her room, the blue room. She's not in it. The window's open and her boots and her coat are missing and... Nell's breath was coming fast. There's a note on the bed. It's addressed to you. Lucien looked at Nell. The candle in his hand was very steady. His chest was not. Get Voss, he said. Get a lantern. Get 2 of the stablemen. He moved past her and up the stairs at a pace that was nearly running without being running, because the part of him that had spent 34 years managing every reaction and governing every impulse was still present, still functional, still insisting that a duke does not run through his own hallways. But the part of him that had stood by the fire and watched her sleep did not care about any of that. He pushed open the door to the blue room. The window stood open. Cold air poured through it, lifting the curtain in slow pulses. On the pillow where her head had been, a folded piece of paper. 3 words visible when he picked it up and held it to the lamp. 3 words in her handwriting, careful and direct, like everything else about her. I am sorry. He looked at the open window, at the snow outside already filling in the prints that ran from the base of the wall toward the tree line, at the darkness of the moor beyond, which went on for miles in every direction and had already begun to swallow the evidence of which way she had gone. For 1 full second, Lucian Ravenscar stood in his mother's room holding a three-word note and felt something he had no architecture for, something cracked open and unmanageable and entirely his own. And then he set the note on the pillow, turned to the door, and walked with absolute deliberate speed toward the stairwell. He was going after her, not as a duke, not as the man who owned the house and the land and the obligation. As a man who had stood too long behind walls of his own construction and had run out of reasons to stay inside them. Whatever was waiting on the other side of that door, the snow, the dark, the moor, the argument of the world, he was going to meet it directly, for the first time in his life. The snow was serious now, not the decorative kind that softened the moor into something a painter might choose. This was the working kind, thick and directional, driven sideways by a wind that had been building since sundown and had found its full voice in the hours since dark fell completely. Lucian came through the servants' entrance at the back of the hall with a lantern in one hand and his coat half buttoned, Voss 2 steps behind him and one of the stablemen, a broad-shouldered Derbyshire native named Croft, moving ahead with a second lantern already angled toward the tree line. The prints were still visible. Barely. The snow was filling them fast, but they were deep enough. She had been moving quickly, her weight pressing through the top crust into the softer layer beneath. And they ran northeast, away from the road, toward the section of tree line that opened onto the footpath that connected the estate grounds to the village track 3 miles out. 3 miles. In this, with a fever that had been breaking but had not broken, Lucien did not say anything to Voss. He followed the prints. The cold hit the back of his throat with every breath and settled in his lungs like iron filings. He had grown up on this moor. He knew its specific cruelties, the way the ground changed character under snow, soft in places that looked solid, hard in places that gave no warning, the way the wind came off the north ridge in sheets that could disorient a person 20 feet from a path they had walked 100 times. He knew it, and he moved through it, and behind him Voss was saying something about the pace, and Croft was angling the lantern, and none of it reached him as anything more than background. He was running calculations. She had maybe a 40-minute head start. Moving fast initially, the print showed that the depth of the toe strike versus the heel, but the fever would be burning her reserves faster than the cold, and the cold itself would slow the burn but replace it with a different kind of exhaustion, the specific leaden heaviness that comes when the body's heat production starts falling behind the environment's demands. He knew the math. He did not let himself run it all the way to its conclusion. He found her 11 minutes in. She was at the edge of the tree line where the footpath met the property boundary wall, a low stone boundary, barely knee-high, that she had apparently sat down on and then not gotten up from. She was hunched forward with her hands braced on her knees, her dark hair plastered to her face by the snow, her breathing visible in rapid white bursts that told him everything about the state of her lungs. She had her coat on. It was not enough coat. Miss Vale. She looked up. Her face in the lantern light was exhausted and determined and furious in the specific way that a person gets furious when they have been caught doing something they were absolutely certain was the right decision. I am fine. You said that yesterday, and you had a fever of 103. I am leaving, she said. I am leaving before I make your situation worse than I have already made it. Lord Ashcomb's people will be gone tomorrow, and there will be nothing for anyone to use against you if I am simply not here, and Ashcombe withdrew the petition. She stopped. 2 hours ago. The document is signed. It is in my safe. He leaves tomorrow morning and takes every piece of this with him. Lucien crossed to where she was sitting and stood in front of her. The wind pushed between them. He looked at her face, at the specific quality of the silence that had taken over from her words. And he understood that she had built her entire decision on the foundation of a problem that no longer existed, and now she was standing in the middle of a moor at night in the snow with a collapsing fever trying to find a new reason for the same conclusion. You should have told me, she said. I am telling you now. Before I... She stopped, pressed her lips together. The angle of her jaw was rigid, the way it got when she was holding something very tightly. I did not want to be the thing that cost you everything. I have watched powerful people use other people as instruments my entire life. I did not want to become the same instrument in a different set of hands, and I did not want what has happened to you this week to be my fault. The words came out raw and plainly meant, stripped of every careful layer she normally kept between herself and what she actually felt. The fever had burned through her defenses the way it had burned through her reserves, and what was left was the girl herself, The actual one. The one under the work dress, and the straight spine, and the gray eyes that filed everything without showing the filing. Lucian crouched in front of her so their eyes were level. The lantern swung in the wind between them. His face was wet with snow. He did not wipe it. "None of this was your fault," he said. "Not any part of it. I fell asleep in your bed. You were a girl who had been worked to the edge of collapse in my house by people I employed. The fault for that sequence of events does not rest with the person at the bottom of it." He held her gaze. "I have spent 4 days watching you carry the weight of this household's cruelty, as though it was your natural load to bear, as though being unnoticed was the price of being permitted to exist here. I did not build this house to run that way. I built it badly, and I ran it worse, and you walked into it and showed me every place it was broken without saying a single word, just by surviving it." Isolde looked at him. Her eyes were bright. Fever still? Yes, but something else underneath. Something that was fighting to stay submerged because it was the kind of feeling that once it surfaces cannot be managed back down. "I am a kitchen girl," she said. It was not self-pity. It was a statement of architecture, the structure of the world as she had understood it for 18 years. "I am a kitchen girl from a nothing town with no family left, and no position, and no one who... I am not what this situation requires me to be." "What situation requires," Lucian said, "and what I am choosing are different things." The wind made a sound against the tree line behind her, low, sustained, the Moor's version of a held breath. "You are choosing badly," she said softly. "I have been choosing badly for years," he said. "Every choice I made well looked like distance, looked like control, looked like a man who had built something solid when what he had actually built was a very well-constructed place to be alone." He paused. "I am choosing differently now, that is all. I am choosing differently, and I am asking you to come back inside before the fever I just spent a day managing kills you on a wall 3 miles from a warm room." Something broke in her face. Not dramatically. The way ice breaks on a river, from underneath, the structure giving way in silence before the surface shows it. Her hands came up and pressed flat against her eyes for 3 seconds. And when she took them away, she was not crying, but she looked like a person who understood for the first time that they had permission to. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "Any of this. I know how to carry coal and light fires and disappear into a room without disturbing anything. I do not know how to be—" "Neither do I," Lucian said. "I know how to govern an estate and manage a legal threat and keep people at a distance so precise they can never find the edge of it. I do not know how to— I am learning what I do not know how to do." A pause. "We are both starting from a deficit. That seems fair." She looked at him for a long time. The snow came down between them. The lantern light moved over his face, and she read it the way she had been reading faces her whole life, for the thing behind the expression, the actual terrain beneath the surface people showed. And what she found there, in the face of the Duke of Blackthorn in the middle of his own snow-covered moor at 10 o'clock at night, was not performance, was not strategy, was not the careful construction she had been watching him maintain since the first moment she saw his reflection in that cold window. It was just a man who had figured out, later than most and harder than most, that the walls he had built to protect himself had been keeping him from the only things worth protecting. She stood up. Her legs were unsteady, and she put one hand against the boundary wall to anchor herself, and he straightened and offered his arm without making it into something ceremonious, just presented it the way a person offers a practical thing to another person who needs it. She took it. They walked back through the snow toward the lights of Blackthorn Hall. Neither of them spoke for the first 100 yards. The wind had shifted slightly and now came at their backs rather than their faces, which was the Moor's minimal concession to the situation. Croft moved ahead with the lantern. Voss fell in behind with the particular discretion of a man who understood that some distances are best maintained. "The note," Lucian said, eventually. "I know. I'm sorry." 3 words. "I thought brevity was appropriate." It was not. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. The almost of it was the specific sound of someone who had forgotten they were capable of the real thing and was startled by the proximity of it. "I did not know what else to write." "You could have written that you were leaving and why. You would have stopped me." "Yes." Then brevity was appropriate. He looked at the side of her face, at the slight curve at the corner of her mouth that he had not seen before, small, controlled. The expression of someone who has been keeping their sense of humor locked in a box for so long that when it emerges, it moves carefully, testing the air. Something shifted in his chest at the sight of it. Something that had been a wall the week before, and was not quite a wall now, had become a threshold, and the difference was not architectural, but essential. They reached the servants' entrance. Croft held the door. The warmth of the house came out to meet them like something alive. Inside, Mrs. Harding was waiting with the expression of a woman who had prayed for something and was conducting quality control on the answer. She took one look at Isolde's color and the state of her coat and made a sound that contained an entire philosophy about the decisions young women made when they had no business making decisions. "Back to bed," she said. "Now, no arguments." Isolde looked at Lucien. He looked at her. The look was brief, but it carried weight. The weight of something unfinished that was not urgent because it had its whole future ahead of it, which was a thing neither of them was fully accustomed to believing in. "Go," he said. She went. He stood in the servants' entrance hallway with snow melting off his coat and Voss 3 feet away holding a lamp, and the house settling around him in its nighttime sounds, timber contracting, fire breathing in distant hearths, the specific silence of a large space at rest. And he felt the shift in himself with the same clarity he had felt the cold on the moor. Pervasive, structural, not something he could contain by deciding to. He had spent 34 years being the coldest noble in England. He had done it deliberately, comprehensively, with the systematic skill of a man who understood that the world would use whatever you allowed it to find in you, and that the answer to that was to leave nothing findable. He had managed relationships at distance, and managed estates at efficiency, and managed his own interior life at the temperature of unlit rooms, and called all of it strength. He understood now, standing in the warmth of his own house with snow still in his hair, that strength and armor were not the same thing. That a man who has never been hit does not know what he can take. That the distance he had maintained for years was not the product of power, but of fear. The very specific fear of a man who watched love become a cage in his parents' house, and decided the only safety was in building a cage of his own with nobody inside it. Isolde Vale had fallen asleep in his bed. She had not done it deliberately. She had not done it strategically. She had done it because she was a girl running on empty who had not eaten properly in 4 days and had worked 16 hours, and her body had simply stopped. And in that stopping, in that completely involuntary, impossible to strategize moment of collapse, she had accidentally walked through every defense he had. Not because she was exceptional, because she was real. Because she brought her actual self into every room she entered. Cracked hands, straight spine, gray eyes that miss nothing, and the bone-deep stubbornness of someone who has been told she is nothing. So many times she stopped being afraid of the word. She was not performing. She had never once performed. And a man who has spent his entire life surrounded by performance finds reality the most disorienting thing in the world. He went upstairs and did not sleep. The morning arrived gray and cold and final. Adrian Ashcombe came down to breakfast with the document in a sealed envelope, which he placed on the table beside Lucien's coffee cup, without ceremony or eye contact. Lucien picked it up, did not open it, and set it beside his plate. The two men ate in silence. Sir Percival had apparently decided his entire contribution to the departure would be the physical occupation of a chair. Seraphine came down last. She was dressed for travel, practical coat, hair simply pinned, no jewelry except small pearl earrings that Lucien suspected were her mother's. She sat across from her father, and they did not speak to each other, which was a conversation of its own, dense with everything that had been said in private rooms the night before, and everything that would need to be said in the months ahead. When the carriages were announced, she stood, and Lucien walked with the party to the entrance hall. At the door, Adrian turned. He looked older in the morning light than he had looked when he arrived. Not weaker, just more accurately sized. The inflation of his authority deflated to its actual dimensions. "Lucien," he said, then stopped. Whatever he had prepared to say had apparently not survived the morning intact. Lucien extended his hand. Adrian looked at it, then shook it. The grip was brief and honest, which was perhaps the most genuine exchange the two men had ever had. They left. The carriages moved down the drive and were swallowed by the gray morning, and the gates of Blackthorn Hall stood open and then were closed by the groundsman, and the sound of the latch was the cleanest sound Lucien had heard in a week. Voss appeared at his elbow. "Shall I notify London, Your Grace?" "Send the document to Hartwell. Tell him it is resolved." He paused. "And increase the kitchen staff by 2. I want the workload distributed properly before the week is out." "Yes, Your Grace?" And Voss. He turned. Mrs. Hargrove, I want to speak with her this afternoon. Voss read the sentence for what it was. Yes, Your Grace. The conversation with Mrs. Hargrove lasted 23 minutes and was the most direct exchange Lucian had conducted with her in the 3 years she had held the position. He was not cruel. He was not performatively stern. He was simply precise about what had been done, about what the written account had been intended for, about the fact that the staff of this house were not instruments to be deployed in other people's power negotiations. She sat across from him and received it with the rigidity of a woman who had believed she was serving the institution and was now understanding she had served a guest instead. By the end, she was pale and quiet, and something in her had reset, not broken, reset, in the way that certain machines need to be powered down before they can recalibrate. He did not dismiss her. He told her plainly that the standard of this house was going to change and that she could change with it, or she could not, and that the choice was hers. She chose to change. Whether that would hold was a question for time, but the conversation had happened, and things that have been named cannot be unnamed. He had learned that much from the past week. The afternoon brought the specific quiet of Blackthorn Hall without guests. A deeper quiet, more honest, the house breathing on its own schedule without performance to maintain. Lucien worked through the estate accounts for 2 hours, then walked the east wing to inspect the hearths that had been relaid with the new coal delivery, then stood at the window of the upper gallery and watched the snow melt from the south-facing stones in slow, patient increments. He was still standing there when he heard footsteps on the gallery floor, light, specific, moving with the careful economy of someone who was managing a slight unsteadiness and not willing to show it. He turned. Isolde was dressed in clean clothes, her hair properly pinned, the color back in her face at a level that told him the fever had broken fully sometime during the morning. She stopped when she saw him. The now familiar sequence moved through her face, wariness, calculation, and then, this time, something new in the settling. Something that did not close all the way down into neutral. Mrs. Harding said I could walk as long as I did not carry anything, she said. Mrs. Harding is correct. She came to stand at the window beside him, not close enough to be anything, close enough to be present. They stood together and looked at the moor, which was doing what the moor always did, existing without apology, vast and gray and indifferent, offering nothing but the honest truth of itself. The Ashcombs have gone, she said, this morning. And the petition. Withdrawn, documented, finished. She was quiet for a moment. What happens now? It was the same question she had asked in the East sitting room 3 days ago, but it carried different weight now. Then it had been tactical. Now it was something else. An open door in the shape of a question, asked by someone who had decided to stop standing outside it. The house goes back to its work, he said. The staff gets a fair distribution of duties. The northern tenants get the lease adjustments they were promised. The estate runs. He paused. And I stop governing it from the outside of it. She looked at him. I've been managing this place as though it were a mechanism, he said. As though the people in it were components with functions, and the function of the Duke was to keep all the components running. I have not been living here. I have been operating it. He looked at the moor. You cannot build something real by standing outside of it and managing it clean. At some point you have to walk inside and let it be imperfect and yours. Isolde's voice was quiet and direct. That sounds like something you figured out recently. 3 nights ago. Beside a fire. She said nothing, but the corner of her mouth moved, that small, controlled, emerging thing, more real than any smile he had seen in the past week's worth of performance. I owe you something, he said. Not a debt. Something more straightforward than a debt. An acknowledgement. He turned from the window and looked at her directly. You came into this house with nothing. You were given nothing, protected by nothing, noticed by no one. You held yourself together under conditions that were designed, whether deliberately or by negligence, to make you break. And you did not break. He paused. That is not nothing. That is not the story of a kitchen girl who fell asleep in the wrong room. That is the story of someone who did not stop being themselves, no matter what this house put them through. Isolde looked at him for a long time. Her gray eyes held his without deflection, without the careful filtering she had used since the first morning. When she spoke, her voice was low and carried the weight of something she had held inside it for longer than this week, longer perhaps than she had words for. Nobody has ever said that to me before. I know. It is... She stopped. Her jaw tightened, held, released. It is a very large thing to say to someone. Yes, it is. The gallery was quiet around them. Outside, the last of the day's light was flattening across the moor, turning the snow from white to the pale gray gold that Derbyshire did in the hour before dark. Brief, specific, the light of a place that was not trying to be beautiful, but was anyway. I do not know what I am in this house, Isolde said. I do not know what I am supposed to be or what is appropriate, or I am not asking you to know yet. I am asking you to stay. He held her gaze. The rest is time. It moves at whatever pace it moves. There is no position to perform, no expectation to meet. I am asking for the actual thing, not the version of it that fits a category. A pause. I am aware that I am asking someone who has every reason to be cautious about the word stay to do exactly that. I'm asking anyway. The silence that followed held all of it. Everything the past week had built and broken and rebuilt into something that did not have a name yet, but had weight. The specific weight of things that are real. Isolde breathed in, breathed out. The cold coming through the gallery window touched her face, and she did not turn from it. All right, she said. 2 words. Raw and simple and entirely meant, in the voice of a girl who had stopped saying the careful version because she had run out of reasons to. He did not reach for her. The moment was not made for reaching. It was made for standing side by side at a window in the last of the day's light and allowing the shape of something to exist without immediately trying to define it. They stood there until the light went. In the weeks that followed, Blackthorn Hall began, slowly and without announcement, to change. 2 new kitchen staff arrived from the village agency, and the workload redistributed across the household with a fairness that the longer-serving members initially received with suspicion, and then, gradually, with something like relief. The fires in the servants' corridor were lit on the same schedule as the family floors. The meal times shifted to ensure the staff ate before they were exhausted rather than after. None of these changes were dramatic. None of them were performed as gestures. They were simply adjustments to the mechanism, the quiet revolution of a house learning to run the way it should have been running all along. Mrs. Hargrove stayed. She was harder and less warm than a good housekeeper ought to be, and she would probably never be otherwise. But she kept the written observations to herself and did not test the new standard, and that was sufficient. Nell started laughing again, which Isolde had not realized she had stopped doing until the sound of it came back and made the corridor feel like a different country. Isolde herself moved through the house on a trajectory that had no precedent and therefore no name. She still worked. She worked because she did not know how to be in a place without working, because her hands needed the engagement and her mind needed the structure, and because the work itself, the fires, the cleaning, the ordered repetition of physical tasks, had always been where she thought most clearly. But the work was different now. She was not invisible in it. She was simply present. Lucien sought her out in the evenings. Not dramatically, not with any of the architecture of courtship that the world would have required if the world had been watching. He found her in the places she naturally occupied, the gallery at the end of the day, the small sitting room near the library where the fire burned late, the kitchen garden in the brief bright hours when the snow had melted, and the first suggestion of something not quite winter appeared in the dirt. He brought books she had not asked for, and left them without comment. She left them on the window seat in the small sitting room, and he saw the spines turn differently each time and said nothing about it. They talked. Not strategically, not carefully. They talk the way people talk when they have both survived something and are still taking inventory of what made it through. About the moor, about his father's management style and the specific damage it had done, about her mother's hands and the 3 houses she had served, about what it felt like to walk into a place and understand within 20 minutes exactly where you fell in the hierarchy and exactly how much of yourself you would need to compress to survive in it. He told her things he had not told anyone. Not because he had decided to, but because she had a quality of listening that made honesty the path of least resistance. The kind of listening that does not flinch, does not file for future use, does not calculate. She just received what was said and held it, and nothing that went into that silence ever came back as a weapon. She was the same with him, careful at first, giving information in small amounts, watching for the place where the information would be reshaped into something she had not intended. When it did not happen, she gave more. When it still did not happen, she stopped measuring. There was an evening in late January when the snow had come back heavy, and the fire in the small sitting room had burned down to a deep orange, and they were sitting on opposite ends of the window seat with a book between them that neither of them was reading. And the silence had the specific quality of silence that is not the absence of speech, but its own kind of language. And Lucien looked at her across the low fire and understood that the thing he had been circling since the first night had not been a threat, had never been a threat, had been the single most honest development in 34 years of careful, defended, meticulously maintained living. He had been afraid of it because every genuine thing in his life had been turned against him, or had turned itself into obligation. He had looked at the world and concluded that opening was weakness, that need was a liability, that the cold distance he maintained was not a cost but a strategy. The moor had taught him something else. That night he walked into the snow without his armor on and found her sitting on a boundary wall she had not had the strength to cross. That the measure of a person was not in what they could withstand alone, but in what they were willing to walk toward. In the dark, in the cold, not knowing what they would find when they got there. He had walked toward her. She had taken his arm on the way back. That was how it had started. That was what it was built from. Not grand declarations, not positions negotiated, not the architecture of alliance that the world around them understood. Just two people who had both been compressed into invisibility by different versions of the same force, finding each other on the other side of it, and choosing, quietly, specifically, without performance or pretense, to stay. Blackthorn Hall had been built from silence and fear, a fortress shaped by cold authority and the particular loneliness of men who mistook control for strength across 3 generations. Lucien had inherited it and continued it and believed until very recently that there was no other way for it to exist. He was learning otherwise, room by room, fire by fire. In the evenings, when the moor turned its particular shades of gray and gold, and a girl who had walked 7 miles through snow to a house that did not know her name sat beside a window reading a book he had left without asking, and the silence in the hall felt, for the first time in his memory, like something he had chosen rather than something he had constructed to hide inside. Some things are not built. Some things are simply allowed to exist. That was the lesson the coldest noble in England learned in the winter of his 34th year, in the space between a servant girl's straight spine and his own finally lowered walls. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in the end, everything.